The moment I stood in the middle of Evelyn Thorne's ruined basement, listening to the muffled roar of 30,000 gallons of mountain water turning her custom-built home theater into an overpriced aquarium, I realized that Karma doesn't just have a sense of humor. She has an engineering degree. There I was, my boots squelching on Italian marble that cost more than my first truck, watching her husband's $80,000 projector screen dissolve into a soggy gray rag, while Evelyn herself stood on the stairs, shrieking like a tea kettle about federal lawsuits and insurance claims. But all I could taste was the metallic, cold sweetness of absolute justice. You see, about 6 months ago, this woman decided that the century-old creek running through my backyard was an, eyesore, that didn't end oppose. T fit her vision of suburban utopia, and she tried to bury my family's history under 20 tons of wet cement, never once stopping to realize she was picking a fight with a hydraulic engineer who knew exactly where that water would go once she blocked its path. My name is Elias Vance, and when I moved back to the foothills of the Blue Ridge to take over my grandfather's 3-acre slice of heaven after a pretty brutal divorce, I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for silence. That creek was and oppose. Just a body of water to me. It was a timeline of my entire life, the place where my old man taught me how to read the ripples for trout, and where I now watch my own kids, Leo and Mia, spend their Saturday mornings hunting for crawdads and building moss-covered fortresses. It had flowed through our property since 1924, fed by a deep mountain spring that stayed cold even in the heart of July, and according to the 1930s water rights, tucked away in my safe, that flow was legally bulletproof, a senior claim that predated every McMansion in the valley. But then came Evelyn Thorne, a woman who moved here from a high-rise in Chicago with enough, new money, to buy the biggest house in the Silver Oaks development, and enough ego to think that being elected HOA president made her the queen of the county. Evelyn was the kind of person who wore designer hiking boots that had never touched dirt and smelled like a botanical garden had exploded in an elevator, and within weeks of taking office, she launched what I called suburban cleansing campaign, aimed at anything she deemed, too rustic, She had this terrifying talent for spotting the one thing that made a neighbor feel at home and then systematically using the HOA handbook to destroy it, starting with Mrs. Gable, a widow, who'd kept a small, immaculate vegetable garden for 30 years until Evelyn decided the tomato cages were, visual clutter, and find the poor woman into plowing it under. Then there was Marcus, a guy working 2 jobs to put his daughter through college, who got hit with daily violations because his work van, which was always spotless, was parked in his own driveway for more than 4 hours. Evelyn didn't oppose. Just want order. She wanted submission, and she looked at my creek like it was a personal insult to her property value, a wild, unruly thing that didn't oppose. Belong in her manicured kingdom. The first shot was fired via a certified letter that arrived on a Tuesday, demanding I, remediate the stagnant water hazard, within 30 days or face $500 in daily fines, claiming the creek was a breeding ground for West Nile mosquitoes and a threat to the foundation of neighboring homes. I tried to be the bigger person. I really did. So I walked over to her house with a folder full of my grandfather's original deeds, water quality reports from the state, and my own professional credentials as a hydraulic engineer to show her that a flowing mountain stream is the opposite of stagnant. She didn't oppose. Even let me pass the foyer, standing there in her pristine white house with her arms crossed, looking at me like I was a stray dog that had wandered onto her porch, and she told me, word for word, that, tradition is just a fancy word for being outdated, and that she had the board's full support to, standardize the landscape, She didn't oppose. Care about the law. She didn't oppose. Care about the ecosystem. And she certainly didn't oppose. Care that the creek had been there 80 years before her house was a blueprint. She just wanted to win. But here's the thing about water. You can oppose. Just tell it to stop because it doesn't oppose. Have an ego. It just has gravity and pressure. And if you try to block a natural vein of the earth, it's going to find the path of least resistance, which usually involves going through something expensive. I spent 15 years designing municipal water systems, so I knew that the geology of our hill was a complex layer of shale and clay, and that my creek was the primary relief valve for the entire upper ridge. While Evelyn was busy recruiting other board members by promising them favors if they voted to approve her new drainage plan, I was quietly doing my homework, documenting the fact that her own house sat on a low-lying lot that had been reclaimed with dubious filled dirt back in the 90s. I knew that if that creek stopped flowing through my yard, the hydrostatic pressure behind the ridge would start pushing against the nearest hollow space, which just happened to be her brand new, unpermitted basement renovation that her husband, Greg, was so proud of. Things turned ugly fast when Evelyn realized I wasn't oppos. Going to fold. So she started a stalking campaign disguised as enforcement parking her Lexus at the edge of my property to take photos of my kids playing in the water, and even calling my employer to inquire about my professional ethics regarding local environmental issues. That was the moment the gloves came off, because you can mess with my lawn and you can mess with my patience, but the second you threaten my livelihood and my family's peace, you've invited a ghost into your house. I organized a secret meeting at the local diner with 12 other neighbors who had been bullied by her, people like Mrs. Gable and Marcus, and we realized that Evelyn hadn't oppos. Just been mean, she'd been corrupt, using HOA funds to pay for landscaping That was actually just her husband's cousin's company doing work on her own private lot. We started building a dossier that would make a federal prosecutor blush, but Evelyn was already moving on her final solution, which was a midnight emergency remediation that involved a concrete truck and a total disregard for the law. I'll never forget the sound of that heavy diesel engine rumbling in my driveway at 6 a.m. on a Saturday while I was supposed to be out of town. She had hired a cut-rate contractor to dump 20 tons of quick-set cement into the mouth of the creek where it entered my property, thinking that once it was a solid block, I'd have no choice but to let it stay. My neighbor Marcus called me, screaming over the phone, and I drove back like a madman, arriving just as the foreman was backing the chute up to the water's edge. I stood in front of that truck with my grandfather's 1930 water rights in one hand and my phone on speaker with the county sheriff in the other, and I watched Evelyn's face turn a shade of purple. I didn't oppos. Tino existed as the deputy told her that if one drop of cement hit that protected waterway, she was going to jail for a felony environmental violation. The contractor, realizing he'd been lied to about the permits, didn't oppos to even wait for her to finish her tantrum. He just packed up and drove off, leaving her standing there in the mud, screaming that she was going to own my soul by the time the lawyers were done. But nature has a way of moving faster than the court system, and a week later, the sky opened up with one of those once-in-a-decade Appalachian summer storms, the kind that drops 4 inches of rain in 2 hours and turns every dry gully into a river. Because Evelyn had already done some preliminary grading on a hillside above the creek, illegally diverting the upper runoff to try and dry out my stream bed. The water had nowhere to go but down into the subterranean layers of shale. While she was tucked away in her house, probably sipping wine and dreaming of her next lawsuit, the water was building up behind her foundation walls like a ticking time bomb, searching for any crack, any seam, any weakness in her unpermitted man cave. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the creek rise to its natural banks, feeling the ground vibrate as the pressure reached its breaking point somewhere deep underground. And then I heard it, a sound like a freight train, hitting a brick wall, followed by the high-pitched wail of a high-end security alarm. By the time I walked over there, the water had punched a hole the size of a manhole cover through her basement into oppos. West wall, and because she'd used cheap, unsealed concrete for her renovation, the entire floor had buckled upward, allowing the mountain spring to reclaim its original path right through her living space. It was a literal waterfall, a cascading torrent of brown, silt-heavy water that was swallowing her husband's leather recliners and $15,000 sound system in real time. And there was absolutely nothing the fire department could do, because you can oppos pump out a basement when the entire mountain is trying to fill it back up. Evelyn was hysterical, pointing at me and telling the fire chief that I hadn't done this to her, but I just handed the chief my engineering report from 3 months ago, the one I'd sent to the HOA board warning them that blocking the creek would lead to catastrophic foundation failure on her specific lot. I'd given her the map to her own destruction, and she'd used it as a coaster. The aftermath was a beautiful, slow-motion collapse of her entire empire. The insurance company denied her claim within 48 hours because the basement work was unpermitted and the damage was caused by, and quote, unauthorized alteration of natural waterways, end quote, leaving the Thornberrys with a six-figure repair bill and a house that was legally uninhabitable. Our neighborhood, end quote, insurrection, end quote, finally went public, and the financial audit we triggered revealed that Evelyn had, end quote, misplaced, end quote, over $60,000 in community funds, which led to a formal police investigation and her immediate removal from board. Mrs. Gable got her garden back. Marcus got an apology, and I got a quiet afternoon by the creek with my kids, watching the water flow over the same stones it had touched when my grandfather was a boy. Evelyn ended up selling the, end quote, McMansion, end quote, at a massive loss to a developer who had to spend a fortune just to stabilize the hillside. And last I heard, she's living in a condo where the only water she has to worry about is in a plastic bottle. I still think about that look on her face sometimes, the moment she realized that all her money and all her, end quote, standardized rules, end quote, couldn't and oppose to stop the earth from being what it is. It makes me wonder, though, how many other people are out there right now, living under the thumb of a neighborhood tyrant who thinks they can rewrite the laws of nature and community just because they have a gavel and a title? I see it in the comments all the time. People losing their homes, their hobbies, and their peace of mind to HOA boards that have lost their way. And I have to ask you, at what point does, end quote, protecting property value, end quote, just become a cover for plain old-fashioned bullying? Did I go too far by letting the physics of the situation play out? Or was that just the price she had to pay for trying to bury the past? I'd love to hear your stories about the Karens in your life who thought they were bigger than the world around them. Did they get their, end quote, basement fish tank, end quote, moment, or are they still out there making life miserable for everyone else? Drop a comment and let's talk about it, because sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to step back and let the water find its way.